Okay, let me just jump into it before I make a big deal of it in my head. Welcome back to the Oops. Oh, okay, I made a big deal of it in my head.
You got this, Char. I'm rooting for you.
Welcome to the Plotcast. I'm your host, Char from the Plottery. I'll help you plant little but mighty seeds of motivation so you can watch your ideas grow into beautiful, beautiful novels. So, welcome back to the Plotcast. I'm here today with Carson Long, who has a YouTube channel called Writing Theory. Hi, Carson. Do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself and your YouTube channel and whatever else you want to include in your little character introduction?
I would love to. Hello, everyone. This is Carson Long from Writing Theory. I am sort of a fairly new writing channel on YouTube. Only got started in January of this past year, but I create content that's all about helping you become the best writer that you can be. And I try to make it not boring. That's my thing. I try to make it somewhat fun. I just released my debut novel, a cozy fantasy story about talking dogs as an avid dog lover. And yeah, I'm making videos. I love collaborating with people, and I've been following the Plottery on Instagram for so long. So when I saw the podcast was up and going, I knew I had to reach out.
Yeah, I'm glad you did. That introduction sounded like you practiced it, which totally blew mine out of the water. But I'll let that one slide.
I've done some podcasts before. I'm no stranger to the podcast world.
Okay, well, yeah. Would you want to tell us maybe a little bit more before we jump into the actual topic of the podcast? Do you want to tell us a little bit more about your book? Because that sounds quite intriguing. Talking dogs.
Yeah.
Who doesn't love that?
So right. Well, that was the plan. That was the scheme, right? I was like, yeah. I gotta get into the dog lover readers market. It kind of was born out of I've read cozy fantasy before, and I'm sure there's other readers out there who've read the Legends and Lattes, the can't spell treason without T sort of books. These books that are just like a warm hug when you're reading. And Starlight Farm's Kennel for Talking Dogs was born after reading all these big epic fantasy stories where every single book was about the end of the world and these big dragons that were trying to, I guess, destroy the world, right? I had read, what's the book? Samantha Shannon's book, The Priory of the Orange Tree.
Oh.
And I just finished that. It's a good book. And it has these talking dragons and these dragon-like creatures. And I was like, that was really cool. I liked that book, but I'm kind of exhausted and burnt out of that big epic fantasy series. And then I looked over to my two dogs. I have a golden retriever and an Australian shepherd. And I was like, man, how come no one writes any talking dog fantasy stories? What if instead of a crazy big dragon, what if my dog was just there with me in this fantasy world? And I did a little YouTube short back in February, and that was the birth of the idea. And then I started writing a story and, planning it out, writing it. And I cataloged this whole thing into a 4-part series on my YouTube channel, from the very first idea to the first word to the editing process and even the publishing process to get it out into the world. So if you've ever had a question for what goes into writing a book, how to write a book, it is in that 4-part series, and I plan on doing that for every book that I write. So that's Starlight Farm's Kennel for Talking Dogs. It is a joyful little found family story.
Mm-hmm. I'm just taking notes on your content creation plan there. I'm definitely going to do that myself for the next books that I write. Just snatch
do it.
Right,
the more
right out.
Yeah, the more that we have out there, the better. Because you can sit down and write a script for how to do your protodraft. Hint, maybe that's something we're talking about today. But being in the weeds of writing that draft and talking specifically about that story you're writing and all the challenges and successes that you had, I knew that was what I could provide to my audience, right? Not just here's the abstract of how to do a draft. Here is what I'm currently doing, where I'm failing, and where I'm succeeding.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really like that approach to it. I'm kind of doing a similar thing with my last revision. I didn't really do YouTube before I started working on this recent draft that I completed, and now I'm on draft 3, and I thought, well, whatever, I guess it's not too late to give it a go. So I am
Yeah.
kind of doing a little vlog style video of revisions and how that's going. And yeah, it's kind of difficult to, I'm not gonna lie, it has been difficult to open up about like both the successes and the failings. And just sort of verbalize that. But I think it's a really neat little exercise in just doing that, verbalizing my thought process after I've done like a long revision. And then I'll sit down and I'll just talk to the camera and I'll try and figure out what the outcome of that was. And it kind of actually helps with like getting your thoughts into order. It's kind of like journaling almost, except for a wider audience, I suppose. But at first it is for yourself.
Something that I always found was that I learned the most when I was trying to teach others about something. And this stemmed all the way back into high school, right? My friends were struggling with this sort of like math concept in our math class. Explaining it to them kind of helped me better understand it as well. And that's kind of how I approached the entire YouTube channel. I don't know if anyone else is out there is like that, but there's something special about trying to, I'm a technical writer by trade. And so like my entire career was about taking a complex idea and breaking it down into something more manageable. So it was kind of a natural sort of way to me to get into writing advice and sharing that kind of stuff. What I found really helpful was I took like, as I was writing, I was keeping something that I called a story breakdown of what I was facing and challenges I was encountering in the planning process, in the drafting process, in the editing process. And it kind of just like, as I was writing this story breakdown alongside me drafting my story, it was like you said, like a journal. It was like a real-time look at what I was thinking at the time that I did that. And so I put that into like a 50-page PDF and shared it with all the people in my newsletter when I put the book out into the world. So listeners, if you are interested in that, hop on over to our Discord, the Writing Theory Community Discord server. Let me know if you're interested in that. I can send it over to you for free. It's pretty awesome.
That's pretty cool. This is kind of funny that you mentioned both Discord and also your, what did you call it? A story breakdown? Because when I first started writing it, now I have a chapter treatment, which is kind of probably similar to what you're doing, is like a separate document where you keep notes and stuff. I call that my chapter treatment. But before that, I used to just have a private Discord server just for me with all the channels and stuff. And then I would just go on there and almost like chat to myself and just put down ideas and thoughts and whatever I was planning, whatever I was organizing and stuff. Just
that's
into
not a
that
bad
Discord
idea.
Server. Yeah. Now it's a little bit more neat and a little bit more organized, but those early days, I don't know. It's a nice little trick to almost like chat to yourself and journal while you are.
Definitely.
While you're doing your writing. But yeah, I think that moves us into our topic for today, and that is this sort of idea of revisions and keeping your head clear and like putting the words down on the page, I would say. But we're talking about drafts today, first drafts or early drafts specifically. So moving from planning to writing, do you think that there is a right moment to, be working on your outline and one day it suddenly clicks in your head and you're like, aha, now I can start writing? Do you think that exists?
I think for a lot of people, it doesn't. I just did a video a couple weeks ago called How to Escape Planning Hell, because it is so easy to get sucked into, especially when you're doing something like fantasy or science fiction, which has you building like this whole world and cultures, and it's really fun to do. And it's really easy to get stuck in the planning process. And there's a couple reasons why I kind of figured that a lot of people ended up in planning hell and had a really hard time moving on to the writing process. And the first thing is that when you're planning, it is nearly impossible to do it wrong. I mean, if you are planning out a world, your characters, the setting, the plot, if you decide you want to make a change, it is as simple as like deleting one line of text and changing how you want that plot to go or how these characters need to be paired up. It's very easy to say, I want to make a change. However, when you're writing, it takes so long to get your content down. It takes so much effort. And like, this is art. This is a piece of yourself. It takes so much of yourself to write that chapter or those 3 chapters, or that entire act of your story. And if you realize later that you want to make some sort of change, it's much harder to do. And so planning a story ends up being this thing that you can just kind of like keep doing. And it's really hard to mess up. And it's really easy to feel good about yourself because the potential of your story is so high. In your head, right? You know your story so well in your head. It is really hard to feel bad about it. In your head, it's going to be such a good story. But once you start writing, you're limited by how clearly you can present your idea in writing, how well you can present your characters. And sort of the conclusion of that video, spoilers, was that planning a story and writing your story, while they're part of the same process that we're all doing, are 2 very different skills. And you likely end up doing a lot more planning than you do writing. And yeah, at some point, you need to escape planning hell. And my point here kind of leads me to why I think what I call the Protodraft is so valuable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I totally agree with that. And we'll move on to the Protodraft in a little bit, but I do want to kind of tie into this idea of like being stuck in the outlining process. And I do think that's, I think it's maybe I'm jumping to conclusions, but I think it's maybe more common in projects like fantasy or dystopia, or kind of things that do necessarily require more planning, you know what I mean, like world building and things like that. I've found in my experience anyway, I mostly write, I don't even know how to call them, it's just like literary real world kind of stories. They're historical usually, so there's a bit of research involved, but I did once attempt dystopian sort of futuristic project, and that was like the one project that I spent literal months of my life planning out and maybe writing down like 1 or 2 scenes and that was it. So I have been there, and I do think like it can get overwhelming sometimes when you spend so much time in the outlining hell, as you referred to it.
Well, here's a question for you, Char, is when you're planning these stories that, I'm very much a science fiction fantasy kind of person, but when you're planning sort of this more historical literary fiction, where do you spend most of your time planning? Are you trying to create realistic characters, or are you trying to plan out all those story beats to tell the plot and the story that you want?
Well, I definitely always lean more towards characters. I always spend a lot of time on them, but I think it kind of goes hand in hand with the stories that I write anyway, because it is mostly about like character reactions and character discoveries and things like that. So I don't really spend that much time. I'm not going to lie to you. Not anymore. I don't spend that much time planning them. I usually just have, my prompt, my concept, and I know the characters, or I try to get to know the characters as much as I possibly can before I start writing, but I don't always hold myself back. And I broke through that wall with the project that I'm kind of revising right now. So Statue of a Woman, that is the book that I'm doing the 3rd draft for right now. And that is a historical gothic fiction novel. And that I just started writing it.
All right.
I pretty much just had like my basic outline of like, okay, these are my like 3 main characters, and this is kind of what I want to happen. And then I just started writing it. I was working with a mentor at the time, and I wrote the first 3 chapters like 3 times in a row to try and kind of narrow down things. And I think this book was very much what you would call your sort of proto-draft type thing. The first draft was definitely that, at least up until halfway through the book, and then it sort of transformed into something more coherent, because by the 50% point I kind of knew what the story was and who the characters were, but it took writing out and basically making a mess of the first 50% of the book to get there.
Ooh, been there.
Yeah.
So let me ask you this. I was thinking about last night. I was kind of mentally preparing myself for like, what are some things I could bring to the podcast, and in sort of analyzing my own planning process. There's this age-old question, right? Are you a plotter or a pantser? So first off, how do you feel about, first off, that question? We all know it's not black and white. You're on a gradient. You're either more of one or more of the other, or whatever the case may be. Where do you stand on first this very basic question?
It's a very basic question, but I feel like I'm going to give a very convoluted answer to it.
Right.
I started out as a plotter, and it was with that project that I told you about, the dystopian one. That was like a couple years ago when I was still studying film and television and screenwriting and that. So it was meant to be a TV series, and so I had all these outlines for the episodes and stuff like that. In that area of my life, I would have said I'm definitely diehard plotter, and then I started the Plottery, adequately named, because I thought, I have to be so strict with plot structure and things like that. And then the more I worked with people and the more I actually, wrote my own stuff, I think I got a little bit more lenient with both my clients and myself in how I approach the writing process. And I think it was when I started writing Statue of a Woman that I kind of ended up in a sort of midway between the two of them.
Right. And I think that's pretty common especially for in your journey as you learn more about sort of like the natural, to stay on brand, the theory of storytelling. Like there is a way that you present all of your information that leads to a good reading experience, good like plot twists later on, good character interactions. And I think the more comfortable and confident you get with those skills, the less of a plotter you become, if that makes sense. But I wanted to ask that, and I'm sure everyone listening to this has heard this question and this answer a million times. But last night I was thinking about this, and I realized that based on, and let me know if this if this unlocks something in your brain or if I'm just over here running in circles. I've found out that there are different parts of the planning process that I am planning versus pantsing. And what shocks my audience when I showed them, if you ever come and hang out in the Discord, we do little live streams either on YouTube, sometimes it's Discord only events, but I pulled up my Scrivener, which is what I use for writing. If anyone's familiar, Scrivener, I use that for all my planning in my novel. And I found out when it comes to characters, I do little to no planning. And when it comes to things like plot, I do a lot more planning. And so it kind of unlocked this idea that there are different components in your story that you prefer to discover as you write versus different components that you really want to follow a more rigid sort of structure or outline. And for me, this always shocks people. The character descriptions that I had for some of my characters going into my Protodraft were literally 1 to 2 sentences, and that's it. And some of those 1 to 2 sentences are just like physical descriptors. And it's within that Protodraft that we'll talk about that I, like you said, you sort of start to discover these things about your characters.
100%. I actually, do you know what? I think it's interesting now that you've kind of put it out that way. I think the best way for me to start a project is, at least what I've learned through experience, is nailing down my thematic argument first, and within that, nailing my character arcs. So I do not care who they are as a person, what their personality is, what they look like. I just care about how does their internal conflict or their character journey actually tie into the thematic question that I want to pose through this book. So I did actually recently go back to that project that I told you about, the science fiction sort of dystopian thing. It was about global warming. I had like all these overarching themes and whatever, and I'd be like, I want to talk about that, I want to talk about this, I want to talk about that, but I never had that one sort of driving question as to like, what is the point of the story? Because like it was supposed to be a series, and I didn't have like an end. I was just like, oh, I think I want the protagonist to die at the end. I had no idea why. Like, I had no idea what that was what the point of that was. And I think that was, for me, where the issue was coming from, because I did not have a clear path forward. I didn't have this why. Like, why am I writing this? What am I trying to say with this project? And so I sat down over one weekend, and I was just like, okay, you have one job this weekend, and that is just figuring out the thematic question. That was it. Like, I don't need you to plot anything. I don't need you to think about the characters. You just need to think about what the core argument of this project is. And once I did that, literally everything clicked into place. And I was like, okay, so that's why this character, represents this, and this character represents the opposite of that, and they can be in conflict and whatever. But I had an ending point, and I had why am I writing this? Which to me is incredibly important when I sit down to write a project, because otherwise I'll just be writing in circles, and I won't know where I'm going.
It's interesting that you bring up how this narrative argument is so important to your planning process. I have always considered the theme to be, and let me know if you think the theme and narrative argument are different things. But I always found the theme of your story to be something, and this is going to sound crazy, but until I encountered it in other reading books, the theme to be something you come back to after putting your story down, and then use that to direct your story in future edits. If I go into a story thinking like, here's like the theme I want to present, I have a really hard time planning to the theme, versus if I write a story and then I'm like, you know what, I can tell this is a story of found family and purpose and finding your place in the world, which is what happened with Starlight Farms, Kennel for Talking Dogs. Then in the editing process, I'm sort of like nudging everything further to that point. I'm including more dialogue about not feeling like you're in the right place, or I'm including more moments of characters finding that, I thought this is what my purpose was, but now I'm seeing it's different now that I've seen more of the world and experienced more things. And it's only in the editing process that I feel like I discover that narrative argument and I'm able to nudge things in the right direction.
I think for me, it comes in two steps. So kind of similar to what you are talking about, but basically I always try to at least determine a direction. So for example, for Statue of a Woman, the one I just finished writing, the narrative argument changed completely by the time I started working on my second draft. The first draft, I thought it was going to be about letting go of dead people, letting go of the living, and I was going to make some kind of point of like how it's, maybe more difficult to let go of the living or something like that. But then I came to the end of the book and I was like, no, actually the narrative argument should be about like grudges, like keeping grudges, and how that can sort of hinder your growth as a person and ruin relationships and things like that. And I did not figure that out until I wrote the line that kind of summarizes the whole narrative argument in, I think it was the second to last chapter. So it was literally like at the end of my book, and then I was like, oh, okay, this is what the book is about.
If you find that there is that sort of like theme disconnect, are you more likely to change the story that you're telling, or are you more likely to change the theme of your story, or what you identify as a theme?
The story, 100%. If I connect with a theme and I think, oh, this is it, like this needs to be the heart of the story, then I will go back. And that's what I'm doing right now. With my revision, I'm currently going back and I'm making sure that everything, every little scene, every little detail, every little hint and subtext and whatnot is kind of threaded through with that new argument, I guess, that I've found.
I think that may be one of the reasons why I am hesitant to commit to a theme when I'm still in this planning process, right? So we're talking like, when do you choose to leave planning and start writing? I think I'm worried that I know that, just like how you said you discover your characters and your plot and what the story's about after something like that 50% mark of your protodraft or your vomit draft, I'm worried I'm going to get halfway through my story and be like, you know what? I was wrong about what the theme was supposed to be. And for me, if I'm changing the story after that, that's like, that's like 40,000 words of now like misappropriated storytelling. Maybe that's not the right word. I don't know. But at that point, I'm like, oh no, like now I have to change everything. I think I would more likely change the theme than I would change the story, but that's also coming from someone who doesn't start with the theme, so it's kind of a moot point. I think I live for those moments. I'm not gonna lie to you, I think those are my favorite moments in writing, and I have several of them along the way of ever writing a draft. It's like that aha moment where you're like, oh wait, I think I'm zeroing in on the point of this story. I think I'm getting further. And I have them over and over again. Every time I think I know what I'm talking about, I'll write some more and I'll be like, no, actually, I think I managed to dig deeper and I managed to find something else. And I think
For me, yes, the second draft was up to the 50% mark anyway, was pretty much a rewrite. I did rewrite a lot of it. And then this revision, this third one is going to be a lot of sort of like adding in details and maybe tweaking a couple of details here and there to fit. Mm-hmm. It's not a huge overhaul. Like the foundations are usually always there. I think what I find is that my subconscious already kind of lays those foundations as I write anyway. So it's not mm-hmm. like I have to go ahead and tell a completely different story just because I had an aha moment at the end. It's more just like bringing that full circle and adapting it and maybe placing, I don't know, just adding in a couple of hints earlier on or adding in another subplot or something like that. And it's never, it feels sometimes like it can be an overwhelming task. I know what you mean, like, oh my God, I'm gonna have to change all this whole thing. But really, in the end, if you are sort of leading with that thematic argument, or at least leading in the direction that you think it's going, your subconscious just do most of the work. Because I don't think you could reach the aha moment at the end if you hadn't already laid down some foundations to get you there.
I like that you say you trust yourself to lay the foundations, because I think that's part of the growing process as a writer is, and that journey from being like a strict plotter to a little bit more of a pantser is because you've learned like, okay, I'm confident in my ability to not need to detail every single thing, but to understand how a story works and to put the foundations of a story in there without having to write down every single point I need to make. I found that journey of confidence and of sort of trusting yourself and your writing ability just comes from starting and completing things, which is the hardest part of being a writer. Let's be clear.
Yes.
Like, the statistic that's thrown around across the internet that has no source to back it up, so of course take it with a grain of salt, is like, I think it was something like 3% of first drafts ever actually become made. Yeah, get finished. I've tried to hunt down the source for that. I have had a very hard time finding the original source.
I've heard that too. It was like 97% of writers never finish their books.
Which is a catchy statistic to have in your back pocket as a writing creator trying to teach people how to finish their first draft. Something I've started telling people is find any sort of project that you can start and finish. It doesn't have to be a 100,000 word novel. It could be a novella that's 40,000 words, or something that we've started doing in our Discord are these writing challenges every 1 to 2 months. And this is a short story. I say challenge, not contest, because it's meant to be collaborative and everyone sort of lifts each other up. But it's just an excuse to start something new and to finish it. Just get to that finish line, because you learn a lot about your writing process anytime you finish a story, because you've experienced what works and you've probably experienced some things that didn't quite work. So that's been a really valuable thing for our community, is just having something to focus on to start and complete in a week's time and be done with it.
Yeah, I think it's very valuable to finish a draft, even if it is a protodraft, or as I like to call it, a vomit draft, because it is, it's just that feeling of finishing something that you committed to, rather than, I don't know, writing down the first 3 chapters and figuring out that it doesn't quite work as you planned it, and then restarting those 3 chapters and replotting the entire story based on your discoveries. Because most of the time, that you do have to get to the end of a project in order to make the most significant discoveries. Like I said, that thematic argument, which was the answer to all of my subsequent drafts clicking, did not come to me until I wrote the second to last chapter. Right. So if I hadn't pushed through that first draft, even though I knew, the whole 50% of my first 50% of my book was going to have to get rewritten, if I had stopped and rewritten that first 50%, it would not be with the intent of supporting that thematic argument, which I would have had to rewrite anyway. But I didn't. I just told myself, no, you have to get to the end first before you actually start to rewrite.
Char, you're hitting on some points that I would identify as like the most common reasons that writers avoid writing down that first draft. That is the biggest thing that I tell people on my channel, is that the first draft is hard. And there's a couple reasons why. And I think everyone at the start, or maybe not the very start, just like the the first couple stories that you're trying to tackle seriously, there's a couple things that always get in your head. And for me, what I experienced when I was first writing these first drafts and kind of like wanting to create these words and really taking writing seriously, I always held the first draft to a higher standard than I should. And everyone in the world told me your first draft is going to suck. And I said, yes, my first draft is going to suck. I said that out loud. I put that into the universe. But when I wrote, I still looked at my first draft and I said, this sucks. I'm a bad writer. Even though everyone in the world says that happens. For some reason in my head, and I'm sure even in the subconscious of other people out there, for some reason you think whatever I'm right is going to be better than what I think. And that's never the case in the first draft. And it's hard to get over that sort of mindset of like, okay, I'm writing a first draft, but I'm not liking what I'm seeing. And that may be the number one reason why I think people don't finish their first draft. They're holding themselves to that higher standard. And that sort of builds on top of itself if you're also editing while you're writing. Because think about what editing is. Editing is you hyper-focusing on the bad parts of your story. I legitimately got like in a really dark place when I was editing Starlight Farm's Kennel for Talking Dogs because I realized I was reading, 50-something thousand words. It's a pretty short book. And I was highlighting everything I did wrong. And I was underlining everything that needed to be changed. And I was looking at all my past work and being like, what am I doing? I have so much more work to do. And that mindset was a little toxic for me. I don't know if other writers out there have gotten into that. Some people say you shouldn't edit your own work. I don't have the money to not edit my own work. Yeah. I don't have the money to pay for an editor.
No. You should 100% edit your work. I think that's the best way to learn to edit and to look at your stuff critically so that you can write better in the next book that you write. I think self-editing is a really important step, even if you are going to hire an editor down the line, or even if you are going to, if you're traditionally publishing, you're going to have an editor, blah, 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 blah. But first, you need to edit your own work. You need to do revisions and stuff like that. And I think it's so valuable to learn.
100% agree. 100% agree. I learned a lot about my writing style and my natural voice in doing my own editing. But what I had to do to mentally sort of prepare myself for all this was also at least recognize the positive things in my book. Just as I was highlighting all these things, this isn't a good line of dialogue for my character. This was a weird choice for the character. This needs to be changed, yada, yada, yada. I also took a green highlighter and I highlighted the parts of my book that made me happy, made me smile, made me laugh. And that was like, whew. That was a big mindset change. So anyone who's struggling out there with editing, acknowledge the things you did right.
Yeah, that's actually funny you say that. I am doing the exact same thing for this revision that I'm currently working on.
Oh, so good.
I have the green highlighter also. So I'm always highlighting the lines that I'm like, oh, this is really good. Oh, I really like how I wrote that. And I think it's good for the mindset, but it's also good as setting a self-imposed standard to your own writing, because you can look at those lines and be like, okay, if I am struggling with description or whatever, I can look at all these lines that I've highlighted that I really liked and try and almost mimic the tone or the atmosphere or whatever that I did in that line. And it's almost like learning off of your own writing, which I think is it's a neat little trick. But anyway, we're getting off topic a little bit here. But we're talking about first drafts, not editing drafts. But yeah, I think, do you want to tell us a little bit about this concept of the Protodraft that you were talking about?
The Protodraft. Oh, I am so glad you asked. This is very on brand for my channel. The Protodraft is sort of the thing I've hitched my whole channel's wagon to, because it was sort of the thing that unlocked something in my writing process, in my brain as a writer, to allow myself to like actually start and finish projects. Because just like how we were talking about before, I was holding my first draft to like this higher standard, and I was like reading the chapters I had written before and sort of thinking, okay, well, I need to go back and change this thing. Or in a worst case scenario, I was writing a first draft, I was getting a dozen chapters in, and then I was saying something doesn't feel right, I need to start over. And so the Protodraft is sort of this this concept that came about, and it's been done before. I mean, you hear like draft zero, I think, in screenwriting, the vomit draft that you talk about as well. Same sort of idea, but the way that I sort of tout the Protodraft is it is a no holds barred, like, do whatever you can to get your story down from beginning to end. Anything that happens between that beginning and end, you cannot let it stop you. And to give you some examples of what kind of things, like, this mentally was me being able to say, like, even if I can't get over this idea of holding my first draft, I'm doing air quotes right now, my first draft to a higher standard, if I change the name and the purpose of this first thing that I'm writing, a lot of those sort of mental catches disappeared. And so the Protodraft was sort of just like, take whatever planning I've done, internalize it, and start writing. And I always start, and the very first thing to a Protodraft is the temporary beginning. Because I also had a lot of trouble with, everyone tells you the first line of your novel needs to grab the reader's attention, suck them in. The first chapter should do all of these things. Look, if I'm going into a Protodraft, I don't know what I want that opening image to be. I don't know my characters well enough to feel confident in how I'm presenting them. Yes, it's like a draft, and I'm going to come back and edit it. But the mental pressure of getting that first opening scene right was also something that was prohibiting me from starting things and finishing things. So I start every Protodraft with a temporary beginning. I write the beginning of the book with the knowledge that once I learn so much more about my characters and their journeys, I'm going to come back to the scene and completely redo it and know much better about how I want to present that character's initial image. Because now I know where they're supposed to end up, and I didn't quite know that before. And that temporary beginning, that was big.
I learned that through rewriting my first 3 chapters 4 times with my mentor.
Yeah, it's a big deal. You know, traditional literature is all about telling you about the opening image, the first line. You can go look up articles of every book that has the best opening line, 1984 to Stranger in a Strange, whatever the big all-time greats are. And the reality is, I'm not going to know what that opening line needs to be yet. So I always start with the temporary beginning. I just get something down. I'm trying to discover how this character needs to start. I'm trying to discover how the story needs to start, but I'm not going to let it stop me. I'm going to write it with the thought that I'm going to come back and tackle that. So before I move on to other Protodraft things, what do you have any similar concepts in your vomit draft?
100%. There's this method I do. It's maybe more of a practical tip, but I kind of like what you mentioned about almost like removing your mindset limitations of, for me, it's like, if I can make writing this chapter feel like not a commitment, I'm going to write it just like that. And so what I do usually, I'm very much an audio first kind of person. So I think through dialogue and through words and sounds and things like that. So what I usually do is I literally just draft the dialogue of whatever scene that I'm writing, and then in parentheses, this is very crucial for me, for my head, for it to be in a parentheses. If I put something in a square parentheses, I immediately get this like lift off of my shoulders, basically, and I can write whatever in that parentheses that I want, and that is usually descriptions, maybe like vomiting down sort of internal monologue or things like that. Whatever I think, I need to put here. Sometimes it'll be just as simple as like, I need this character to think about this thing right here, in this spot, and I don't actually go into what he's thinking about. I don't actually write that down, or I put something like, insert a fancy description of the train station or whatever, and I call them placeholders, basically. And so whatever is in a parentheses is a placeholder, but it very often happens that even while I'm writing inside a placeholder, I'll start with the idea and then I'll just draft out a whole sentence or a whole paragraph of description without even actually putting pressure on myself to do that.
Yeah. I do a similar thing. This is another Protodraft pro tip.
Yeah.
Another similar thing I do is, I think inevitably after you get past your first act, your first 25% of your novel, you've gone through the intro, your character introductions, your crisis, the climax of that first thing, your inciting incident of your novel, I think it's pretty easy to plan that part of your novel out pretty well.
Yeah.
And then you get to what a lot of plot frameworks just call rising action or fun and games, aka 50% of your whole book.
Yeah.
That they just chalk up to those things. And that's where I found that things like writer's block can come up for writers. And so I recommend all the time. Something that was a big sort of a mindset shift to me as well was the idea of not writing linearly. This idea that you need to finish every single scene in sequential order. And for some people, you can do that. And you're able to sort of like, okay, well, I'm going to skip ahead. Some people can't do that. Totally get it. But what I've found is if I'm writing a scene and for whatever reason, I don't feel like it's working, or I don't feel like I'm nailing the characters, or maybe I'm just bored, I know that that part of the story is going to suffer if I keep trying to push through it. So I'll do sort of what you do is I'll put down some parentheses or curly brackets or square brackets, something. I'll put something down and just make notes of what I want the scene to accomplish and move on. Go to the next scene, act like I got everything down exactly how I wanted, and then keep writing, because the protodraft is all about continuing to move forward. If you get bogged down in this one scene that has characters moving from point A to point B and talking, getting backstory, don't overthink it. Move on to your next thing. Make some notes about what you want to accomplish there. In all likelihood, something I've said before is boring writing is boring reading. If you're not having fun writing that scene, the reader maybe isn't going to have fun reading that. I hope that makes sense. And it's probably not a good hard and fast rule, but it's a good mindset.
I 100% agree with that. Every time I see someone say, I think this scene is boring, it's like, okay, if you're bored writing it and you're still pushing yourself to write it, even though you feel bored, your readers are inevitably going to feel bored. I think that's just a hard and fast rule, to be honest.
Yeah.
I think we can go as far as saying that. But yeah, I think I do the same thing with the scenes that I get stuck in. I have a history with writing non-chronologically, and it's not a nice history.
Oh no!
So I don't do it. I don't do it anymore. But I do the thing that you mentioned, which is like if I get to a scene, for me, it's usually either like I've not worked out the purpose of that moment or of that exchange, or it's just like not quite clicking, and I can't work out why at this stage with my limited knowledge of the characters and the story, because I haven't actually finished writing it. I will usually just say, you know what, let's just leave this for later. And most of the time, the whole concept of the scene will change when I come back to it after I finish the first draft, and I'll realize, this is why it wasn't working, and that makes total sense.
Yeah, exactly. And the protodraft is all about those moments of where you're just like, I'm losing some momentum. How do I keep moving forward? How do I make sure this doesn't bog me down? So the protodraft, you got your temporary beginning. If you're hitting a scene where you don't quite know how to move forward, you're jotting some notes down and you keep moving forward. And sort of the whole purpose of the protodraft is to keep moving forward. So like I've had moments, I'm like 20,000 words into a story and I've been like, you know what? This story shouldn't be third person. This story should be first person. And instead of rewriting 20,000 words to get back to the same point that I'm at now, I know what's supposed to happen there. I'm going to be editing it anyways. I'm just going to make a note that says I'm switching this story to first person and I'm going to keep writing. Right? That protodraft is all about just getting through all those important parts of your story because you're going to learn so much about your characters and about your plot and about your theme and about your character journeys. By the end of your protodraft, you want to bring all of that gathered knowledge back through it to tighten everything up into what I would call your first draft.
Yeah, I like that. I think really what it does is not even it's not even anything like scientific. It's literally just a mindset shift. It's just a game almost, or like a trick that you play on your brain by coming up with this name, like this is the protodraft, so it doesn't matter. Because I think 100%. Sometimes, like with first drafts, what you said, we see all of this stuff online about like, oh, first drafts can suck, whatever, but it's still a first draft, and you still kind of want to get it to a good standard, because there are people out there who like boast about, I just did a first draft and then I did some edits and then that's it.
You mean liars?
Yeah, exactly.
You mean liars out there?
I do. But I think that gets in your head though. Sometimes, and you do hold yourself to a higher standard than you would anyone else. And you're always like, oh, well, that person's first draft can suck, but mine needs to be better. And I think
it comes down to this, like, writing is an art. It is us pulling pieces of ourself onto the page. And no matter what, if you are not happy with what you're seeing, if you get demoralized by what you're seeing, it is so easy to just not want to continue. There is nothing, especially when you're writing your very first story, you don't have any published work out there. You don't have anyone who is like asking about your next book. And I'll tell you right now, the only people I have asking me that kind of stuff are like family and friends.
Yeah.
And I just think they're being nice. So shout out to family and friends for trying to be nice. And I appreciate that. But the thing is, like, when you're writing your very first book, it's a purely self-motivated thing. And self-motivation as a concept is hard to keep going because life hits you 1,000 different ways and knocks you down.
Hello, listener. It's time for us to judge a book by its cover. Have we got what it takes to uncover the true story without looking at its pages? Well, let's find out. Right, we're going to be talking about the book called Rewitched. So not Bewitched, but Rewitched, by Lucy Jane. What do you want to describe the book cover and what you're seeing?
Oh, yeah. So what we're looking at, Rewitched across the top of our cover, very similar to like something you would see from sort of a rom-com Bewitched movie, very similar typeface. Our cover has the top third with sort of a full moon and a dark sky. And then the bottom third, we have a pink building where we see a window. Our main character is there reading a book, but also potentially casting magic out the window, fluttering the leaves and sending them sprawling across the cover, and a hint of a black cat sitting on the roof staring out at us. Honestly, the cat looks almost hyper realistic compared to some of the other art here, but still a cute cat. The vibes, do you want me to go into vibes, or are we just just talking?
Go for it.
Vibes I'm getting from this, Rewitched. So for those who don't know, right, there is this movie called Bewitched that was really popular. And I think that Bewitched movie in the mid 2000s was a remake of a movie or TV show that happened in the past. I'm not 100% sure.
I mean, probably. They all are.
They all are. Oh, classic Hollywood. But the vibes we're getting from this novel is kind of whimsical, kind of fun. It's got that sort of art style that's kind of sits between like a cozy fantasy and like an Emily Henry kind of like, we don't have like two romantic characters on the screen, but it's like kind of illustrated in that nice way. It looks like it's not too serious. It looks like it would be a fun read. And the vibes we're getting is definitely sort of something a little cozy.
Yeah. I was, the first thing that I thought when I saw this book was cozy. Like, it just looks so cozy, and it has like autumn vibes to it as well with the orange trees. And I really like the colors, sort of complementary, blue and orange and stuff.
Now, before you go on and potentially read a blurb, here's something I want to ask you, because this became a pretty big talking point on my book cover, Starlight Farms, Kennel for Talking Dogs. When you see this cover,
do you ever get tired of saying the full name?
Well, since we have such a lovely audience and maybe hearing this title for the first time, I have to say it in its entirety. On stream and everything, I just say Starlight Farms because it is a mouthful.
Right.
There's a whole other conversation about book titles to be had. But what I wanted to ask you is, when you see this book cover, what sort of age groups or age range or whatever that term would be, what do you get from this cover?
I think like just teens, maybe not teens and YA sort of thing, if that's different. I don't know if that's even different, but sort of 12 and above maybe. I don't know. Okay. Maybe. I feel like these days, this could just be like a very cute YA sort of thing.
Right.
But I don't know.
When I see this, and not knowing the genre, right? If you're going to tell me this is a mystery thriller,
I don't think
I would
that
be
it
very,
is.
I'd be very caught off guard. But if you were to tell me this is a romance, then I'm thinking, oh, it's like cozy. This is probably not marketed as YA, because I would think that like there's such a trend of like the Emily Henry novels that have this very stylized kind of illustration, and those are marketed, as far as I know, maybe kind of all ages, but kind of adults. When I did my cover, I think one of my big failures was it ended up looking too whimsical, which comes off almost like as a kid's book. And so now when I look at covers that have that cozy aesthetic, I'm also thinking, okay, well, sometimes that cozy, whimsical aesthetic comes off as a book for kids, which I'm not saying this is a book for kids, but that was something that the cover defining the age range was kind of tripped me up as I was working with my cover artist. So when I look at this, I'm kind of getting, 16 and up, kind of like what you said, 12 and up. I'm kind of thinking like this could be fun. It's not going to have any serious themes, but I still think looking at this, I see the main character in this window as kind of an adult. So I would think it is like an adult driven book.
Yeah, I think I would say she's probably like a young adult. I don't know. We can't see her face, so I can't really judge. But yeah, I think the vibe is really cutesy and stuff. So that's why I would. And I think the cat also, it's just very like, yeah, I don't know. It looks like a cute book and a cute story. So that's why I would think, younger audiences and stuff. But I am actually looking at it on Amazon right now, and reading age actually says 18 and up.
So on my book, I wanted to say that like the age range for this book is kind of like all ages, right? Because like my, Starlight Farm's Kennel for Talking Dogs doesn't have any major like adult themes or anything like that, but it's also not like a kid's book. So when I was setting it up on Amazon, I was like, I'll just say like if you're 12 and up, you can read it. But what that shows up on Amazon as is 12 to 18. And now I'm like, I can't. It says, and now it portrays itself as a kid's book. Even I had to go into like the subtitle of my book and be like an all ages adventure or something like that, because Amazon kind of screwed me on that. Thanks, Amazon. Thanks, Jeff.
That's good to know, because I write really weird books. Like they're not. I can never determine the audience for my books. I don't know. I had a lot of issues with this in my
folks. You heard it here first. Course. Char writes weird books.
I do.
Get your weird books here on the Plotcast.
Yeah, no, I had a lot of issues in university because of this, because I kept saying my book is like all ages. It's appropriate for all ages, and I always write mixed narrators. Like one of them is 13, the other is 35. So it's like a lot of discrepancy in terms of ages. It's not very clear cut, like this is a kid's book or this is an adult book. But that's good to know about the Amazon thing, though. If you
here's I think something I picked up. So I mentioned one time in this podcast, like my career before really trying my hand at content creation and being an author and everything was a technical writer. So I worked with these software companies to write like documentation for their software developers to help them do their job better. It was all technical, very dry. But one of the major concepts in there is the idea of primary audiences, secondary audiences, and something called tertiary audiences. And what I would suggest for most writers is for you to say, yes, my book is all ages, but who do I think will appreciate this book the most? Who is the reader that is going to identify most with this theme, identify most with these characters? For my book, Starlight Farms, it was mostly about like finding your purpose and founding your family, and also being able to love something so much that you can let go of it when the situation deems, this is the better life for something. And so that's definitely a more adult kind of theme. You're not going to find too many, teen books. I'm sure there are some out there that have those themes. I mean, finding your purpose, don't get me wrong. That's a classic coming of age kind of thing. But what I'm saying is that if I were to do my book setup again on Amazon, I would probably say 18 up, just to be like, don't get it twisted. This is a book for adults too. And then kids who see that, or teens who see that posting, are probably just going to order it anyways if they associate with its title and concept and everything. So don't be like me. Don't fall for my mistakes.
That's fair enough. Okay, well, to go back to this book, I guess I'll just read the blurb because I think I'm not really getting much story-wise out of this. I mean, it says Rewitched and it's time to rediscover her magic, so I presume it's going to be about, coming back to her magic that maybe was long lost or that maybe she ignored, which is like a pretty standard sort of fantasy trope. But yeah, we can jump into this because I'm seeing some really interesting descriptions here. Somebody from Stylist says that it is the equivalent of Gilmore Girls, which is pretty awesome. I definitely gives those vibes.
I've seen that comparison popping up more and more in book blurbs. And I think, as someone who recently had their wife show them Gilmore Girls and watched through the whole thing, to me, that means really witty dialogue, fast-paced characters that are saying witty, funny things.
Yeah, probably. And also I think it's just cozy autumnal vibes, that sort of thing.
Gotcha, okay.
It is Gilmore Girls season right now, so.
Oh my god.
Yeah, you're going to see a lot of it probably.
What character are you from Gilmore Girls?
What character am I? I don't know. I have no idea, to be honest. I don't really identify with them because they are very extra. You know what I mean? Like they're very
yeah.
They're a lot. I think my favorite is definitely Lorelai by a long shot. But and then also I really like her mother Emily. But
gotcha. Interesting. Especially for 3 seasons, Emily is not a very likable character.
Yeah, I just love her acting. Maybe it's just the actress. I just think that she's such a...
Oh, she's awesome.
Yeah, she just plays her character so well. But right, let me read this blurb. Belladonna Blackthorn hasn't lost her magical spark, but she hasn't seen it in a while either. Balancing work at her beloved London bookshop Lunar Books with handling her toxic boss and concealing her witchcraft from those around her, Belle is burnt out. Perfecting the potential of her magic is the last thing on her mind. But when her 30th birthday brings a summons from her coven and a trial that tests her worthiness as a witch, Belle risks losing her magic forever. With the month of October to fix things and signs that dark forces may be working against her, Belle will need all the help she can get from the women in her life, from an unlikely mentor figure, and even from an infuriating coven watchman who's sworn to protect her. So we do have a little bit of romance in this.
For sure.
Yeah, and some strong womanly vibes, I think, like a female coven or something like that.
Right.
And the month of October.
Now, this may be recency bias for me. I've been doing a lot of research into doing a video on fan fiction and a deep dive as someone who never participated in fan fiction to its role that it plays in the literary world. And I got to tell you, I'm getting fan fiction vibes here from Sabrina the Teenage Witch. Did you ever watch that show?
Oh, well, no. Yes. When I was a kid, I don't really remember the original, but I did watch the Netflix remake recently.
Right. So I don't want to say just a black cat, right? Because that's a main character in Sabrina the Teenage Witch, but that's also just a very normal trope for witch stories. But also this idea of here we have almost like a political group of magic who determines whether or not you can use magic based on if you break your rules or pass tests or things like that. And so because I've recently been exploring the role of fan fiction in stories, I get those vibes from this book. Maybe the idea is, and I don't want to say it's a fan fiction as a derogatory term. I want to say it's more of an homage to that kind of story. Something I wanted to note. I definitely get some Sabrina the Teenage Witch original series, not reboot vibes from this.
Yeah. No, I like that. I like cozy, witchy fantasy. I've actually been debating writing one myself. I'm coming out with it'll already be out, this YouTube video, by the time I'm talking about it. So you can watch it. I think it's called the Easy Character Template. And it's me setting up basically a character kind of like this, a witch who is suppressing her powers, though I think my story would probably be darker, knowing myself. A little less cozy. But I don't work with fantasy a lot, and I thought I would give that a shot, so you can go watch that if you want to.
Very cool. And we can find that on your YouTube channel, or is that an Instagram reel?
It is just my YouTube channel. I cannot fit that much stuff in an Instagram reel, unfortunately.
Gotcha.
Hey listener, we're about to answer some audience questions. Did you know you could submit questions every month to be answered right here on the Plotcast? You can do this by following my Instagram account at @Plottery and keeping an eye on my end of month Q&A boxes in my Instagram stories. Make sure to submit a good one, and we might answer it on the next episode. Alright, let's get back into it. Elise Caverly asks, what is the best time to write a synopsis? Does it have to be at the very beginning? I am struggling. So
you said that was Elise? Oh, Elise.
Elise.
Welcome to the club.
Yeah.
Welcome to the club. My personal opinion is I do something very early on called a brain dump. And I think a lot of people do this, right? This is the idea of, I don't fully know my story, but I'm going to write a synopsis anyways and just see where my instincts kind of take me. Like, maybe I know I'm going to have these characters and this kind of journey. Maybe I know I'm going to have this kind of plot. But I found if you go watch my video on my first video on the series of Starlight Farms, I talk about the brain dump, and I even show my entire brain dump on screen. And the first half of it is basically everything that I planned. And the second half of it is just what I let myself continue doing. And then for me, that brain dump is how I sort of take information and work it into a plot framework. But for a synopsis of your whole story, it's going to be continuously evolving as you're getting your story down. Don't think that you lock into a synopsis early on and it's like a rigid framework that you have to follow. At least in my writing style, my characters might make a different choice. I may add characters that I feel like the story needs to have that weren't in my original brain dump, plot framework, synopsis, etc. And you need to leave yourself room to adjust. And then eventually you're going to write a synopsis that's going to go on the back of your book and it'll have everything you need.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think there's two ways to take this question. And then one of them is like writing an actual synopsis that you're going to send to an agent. If you are going to be, querying the project and stuff, you obviously want to have a synopsis. But I actually don't think for probably 99% of writers that it is actually possible to write that synopsis before you write the book, unfortunately.
Agreed.
I wish that it was. I think you can draft a synopsis in, and it does help with like actually structuring out your project and plotting and outlining and whatnot, but I don't think that you can, or that you should, as you said, lock it in. I always think, or I always advise to let your synopsis, your plot grids, your brain dumps, whatever, let them be living documents that change as you actually write that story, as you revise it, as you edit it, whatever. But actually writing that synopsis, unfortunately, if you're writing it for agents, it will have to come at the end, and it will have to be something that you keep working on. But you need to know what the book is actually about and everything that you've actually written in it in order to write that synopsis.
And if you're thinking about when's the earliest I can have that synopsis written and be an accurate reflection of my story, I would say whenever you're done making major editing changes. You may still be doing line edits or copy edits or, those small little details, but you've sort of locked in at that point. Maybe it's like your third draft. At least for me, my draft process is pretty straightforward. Protodraft, revision to first draft, major changes I need to make the story feel as good as it can in that next draft, and then I'll do something like copy edits and line edits. Once you get to the point where you're done making major changes, then you might feel more comfortable writing a synopsis that you can share with people if you're doing some agent stuff. But that's coming from someone who has never done agent stuff.
Yeah, I think it is very helpful to keep rewriting your synopsis and keep working on it as you work on your project also, because this is again something that we did in university, but unfortunately they only taught us to write I think it was a 2,000 word synopsis, because that was the expected amount of something that they could actually grade us on, which is unfortunately very unrealistic for the agenting world, and you have to know how to do it in 500 words, so that didn't really help much. However,
wait, are you telling me that college education didn't directly translate to practice? What a hot take, Char. What a hot take.
No. I love the course. I absolutely love the master's degree. It was amazing. Yeah. But Yeah, the synopsis thing just didn't really land. But in any case, I do think it's very valuable to just keep working on your synopsis anyway, sometimes it can actually help you with the developmental edits. If you can't fit, I would say honestly, personal opinion, 500 words is way too short for a synopsis. I always find the golden sort of rule, or the golden word count for every client that I've worked with and for every story that I've personally tried to summarize is around 700 to 800 words. And I wish that they would bump that up to that ratio, because I think that works so much better.
Right.
With the 500 words, you have to cut so much detail and you lose a lot of space to actually grab the person who's reading the synopsis. But if you cannot for the life of you put down your story in less than 1,000 words, then you might have to ask yourself why that is, and whether there's potential for it to be 2 books if it's too long, or whether you can kind of have a bird's eye overview of what your story is about and see it on the 1 page or 2 pages, and kind of make out whether there needs to be any developmental changes, or whether you're reading it and you feel like, oh, wait a second, like this, I don't know, Act 1 is way too long because I spent, I don't know, half of my synopsis talking about Act 1 and then I blitzed through Act 2 in 100 words or something like that. So that could be a cause for concern, but it is a good way to sort of just clear your head and see it, and then move into developmental edits, but without necessarily locking that in as your synopsis.
I like the idea of it being a living document, right? Something that you're kind of updating and changing as your story updates and changes, because it's kind of a reaffirming thing. It's kind of nice to be able to say definitively, this is a story about purpose, or this is a story about redemption, and feel like that's accurately reflecting your novel. When you're doing that as like a brain dump early on, it's probably going to change 100 times before you end up finishing your protodraft and solidifying it into a first draft. So keeping it up to date is almost like checkpoints for your own brain to be like, okay, yes, I'm still certain that my story is meant to do this, and I'm still certain I present this theme or this character journey really well. And that can be a little bit of a mental boost you might need.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I quite like that. Okay, our second question is from Lachey Joe. How do I write the perfect fantasy opening? And the reason I chose this question was because I think you deal with fantasy, right? You're very fantasy driven.
Lachey Joe, you crazy. The perfect fantasy open. First, I love your ambition. Set your sights a little lower, but let's talk about openings to fantasy. I can make this a whole video, but I'll keep it short.
Okay.
Because I know we're getting towards the end of the podcast.
Mm-hmm.
When it comes to a good fantasy opening, you have to realize that there are some things that you're trying to accomplish. Of course, you're doing character work. You're showing your character introductions. But this is the hardest part to get through in fantasy, is building your exposition. Right? This is saying, hey, you cracked open this book into a new world. Let me make sure you know what world we're getting into. And that can be hard for a lot of authors. The number one thing, of course, when you're in your fantasy opening, and whether it's the opening scene or the opening 10% of your novel, exposition does not come through the form of narration. Don't get it twisted. You are building your world through character interactions, through their dialogue, not through a paragraph that says this is what the world is like, not through a paragraph that says here's what's different about this world. Exposition needs to come through terms of character interaction and dialogue. And the biggest thing to say there is let's understand what exposition is. I think the best definition I've heard comes from Robert McKee's writing book Dialogue, and it says exposition is what the reader needs to know to be invested and experience the story.
Not to be confused with info dumping.
Yes. And so this exposition, whatever that information your character or your reader needs to know, it needs to be presented through character interactions, through action or dialogue. That's number one, because every fantasy book is going to have a level of exposition that needs to be presented. Number two, make sure that you're not trying to present all the information at once. one of the great things that Brandon Sanderson has brought to the forefront of literature is the idea of read and find out. Readers now have more trust in authors. Before you break that trust, don't break that trust. They have more trust in authors to say, I still have questions, but I'm going to read and hope that those answers come later. You do not need to explain the entire world in the first 10% of your novel. All right, those are two major concepts. The other major thing I want to bring out here is to understand the tropes of the genre that you're writing in. What are the reader expectations? This is a big thing. Whether you're writing fantasy or science fiction or historical fiction or mystery thrillers, there is sort of an understanding of what that reader is getting into. And the best way you can understand that is by participating in that genre. Read the other fantasy stories. You'll find a major trope in traditional fantasy if you go look at something like Lord of the Rings or The Wheel of Time, which both have characters in their normal world that they are just going through, doing their normal thing. And then eventually there is sort of an invader into their way of life. In Lord of the Rings, you have the ring showing up. You have these dark riders showing up. In The Wheel of Time, I won't spoil the inciting incident, but there's sort of like a big attack event that kind of kicks off everything. And now suddenly everything's changed. That is a major trope in the genre. That does not mean that you have to follow that trope. But you should know the trope so you can understand whether or not you want to subvert it. You need to know the rules so you can understand when to break them, right? And that's just one example of sort of an opening to a fantasy book. Another very common thing is a lot of people love having a prologue. I call it an action prologue to your story. Some exciting piece of information that's going to tell the reader what the major themes of the story might be, what the kind of world we're living in. Is this going to be a kind of fantasy situation where magic is out and about being used like Harry Potter? Or is this a situation where magic doesn't have very many rules like Lord of the Rings? Or is this a world that has little to no magic like Game of Thrones? Your action prologue at the beginning of your story is an author's way of saying, here's a really cool scene I want you to experience. Maybe it doesn't even contain any major characters, but this is sort of what you're getting into. And after we finish that action prologue, let's go over to our main characters. Game of Thrones does this in spades. It has a 3,000 word action prologue, doesn't feature any of the main characters, but when you leave that prologue, you understand that this is a gritty world that people may unalive, they may die, and that no one's just throwing around magic spells to save the day, but we may be facing some almost like supernatural fantasy people or creatures. You get all of that from 3,000 words of an action prologue before we then experience what our main characters are going through. That is a tool in your writing tool chest, your writing toolbox. Have it in your back pocket. It is a quick way to get people excited about your story without having to lock in any main character stuff right off the bat.
Yeah, no, I like that. I haven't thought about it that way. I think whenever I get the question like, how do you open a book, or how do whether it is a fantasy or not, that's why I let you answer the question, because I'm not a fantasy writer, but whenever I get questions about like how to open a book, it's always, my go-to answer is always just like, you need to present an intriguing character situation that you can have your character, if you have a lot of information to tell us, you can have your character wade through this situation or whatever, and let the readers see how that character deals with it, which in turn tells us a little bit more about the character without actually having to say who the character is or how they are. But you can also use whatever situation you choose to set up your world building. You kind of have to get smart with it as a writer. It's almost like a little cheat, not really, but you're if you want to tell us something about the world building, you have to choose a situation in which that thing becomes relevant, right? You can't just well, you can, but it's probably not going to be very interesting opening a book with just a list of like, this is all the world building stuff that you need to know in order to understand this book. You need to find reason, basically, just to give us all this world building information. But in terms of writing the perfect fantasy opening, you gave some nice examples, but I do think ultimately it is down to your idea and your book and stuff. And you can use other books as contextual reading and see how they do it. But at the end of the day, it's going to be down to who your protagonist is and what your story is about, what thematic argument you're, hopefully asking, and how can you portray that in what would be the perfect opening to your specific book. You know what I mean?
Here's a good question. When do you think your opening has concluded? When do you think you're done with your opening and you're on to the rest of the novel?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I guess this can be taken in like, for me, it's just the first chapter usually is the opening, and the inciting incident is when stuff starts happening, but I wouldn't actually think of that as an opening. I would think of that as the beginning of the plot, really. But your opening is what I consider, I guess, just prepping your reader for the story. And for me, that is placing in all these little hints of the thematic argument, the internal conflict of who the character is and how they are going to change by the end of the book. I think all of that needs to be present in that opening. And then obviously with some novels that require more world building, you also want to sort of situate us in the time and space of where we are.
Yeah. I think I would say that the opening would sort of conclude at the inciting incident, specifically for sort of the point of no return. We've seen the way of life that your characters live in. We've seen their normal sort of operations, and that inciting incident brings all of that to an end. They can never go back to that way of life. And for me, that means your opening of your novel is everything that you do to show what used to be the norm, right? What used to be the norm for your characters.
I think you could almost think of that opening as the ending of the backstory, if you want to look at it that way.
Interesting.
Because I'm very, recently, as of late, I'm very into backstory and looking at whatever book that you're writing, looking at it as a mirror, almost as, your character arc is one side of the timeline, but you have a whole other side, which is the backstory. And I think they're both, in most cases, they are both equally as important. And so I think sometimes in order to write the perfect opening, you really have to, first of all, know how the story ends. That's why protodrafts or vomit drafts are very important.
Preach it. Preach it.
Exactly. But you need to know how the story ends. But I think you also need to know where it actually began, because it's very unlikely that it began at the beginning of your book. It probably began for your protagonist. It probably began years ago. They're dealing with all these issues, and the internal conflict is usually something that a character carries within them their whole life, or from the point of that big event in their backstory or whatever. So you could look at your opening as just, this is the point where that backstory and that internal conflict begins to get challenged, and it's going to be resolved by the end of the story.
I love that. Yeah, I like that. When their resolve gets challenged. That's a good way to say it.
Yeah. All right, well, I think that brings us to the end of this Plotcast episode. Thank you so much for joining me. And yeah, do you have any closing words, any more, you want to say the name of your book one more time?
Oh, I thought you would never ask. Let me, all right. So for everyone here listening, first off, thank you to Char for inviting me on this podcast. It was a blast. I hope you all had a blast as well. If you're looking for a fun weekend read, Starlight Farm's Kennel for Talking Dogs, you can find the link in the description. That is a story just about sort of finding your purpose, what you were born to do. You'll find all the themes in there. You'll like it. It's guaranteed to make you tear up, at least. That's what I tell people. And do not worry, no dogs are this is not a story where the dogs die at the end. I swear I wouldn't do that to you. I wouldn't do that to me.
That's fair enough. I think that's a necessary warning for a book like that.
It is for sure. If you're interested in learning more about writing, of course, you can check out my YouTube channel. I have a video. I tout it as the most important video I've made yet on the Protodraft. You can check that out. It also features my dogs. So that's a dog lovers, if you need another reason.
They're very good actors.
They are. And then if you're looking for an excuse to write, you can hop into our Discord and come join us. We do these writing challenges. Money goes to charity. There's all kinds of fun things that we do over there. And you're just surrounded by other like-minded, fun, invested writers. We have over 300 writers over there. And then the very last thing is, if you're listening to this and it's about to be November, I will be doing live streams all throughout November, taking you through the writing process. It's not affiliated with any bigger event. It's just Novella November over at Writing Theory. Come hang out, come chat, come ask questions, come share your writing. We'll be pulling things up on stream and talking about them, all kinds of fun stuff. And I hope to see you there.
Awesome. Okay, well, I'll have links to all of that in the podcast description so you can get there easily. You can leave us a comment if you enjoyed this or if you have something to add. And other than that, I will see you in the next one. Thanks for listening to the Plotcast. If you want more writing tips and tricks, head over to my YouTube channel. Until next time.